Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Patient-centric to the Core, setting a new standard for engagement strategies in clinical research, hosted by BBK Worldwide, a recognized global leader in patient recruitment and retention. Underscoring its commitment to ensuring patients always have a voice, BBK Worldwide has brought together experts on patient centricity in clinical research. Today's featured speakers are Claire Meunier of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Christel Aprigliano of the Diabetes Collective, and Bonnie Brescia of BBK Worldwide. We'd like all attendees to feel free to submit any questions by typing them into the Questions tab of the toolbar on your screen. They will be answered during the discussion as well as during time reserved at the end. BBK will provide attendees with written responses to all submitted questions as I follow up to today's event. With that said, I would like to introduce Bonnie Brescia, a founding principal of BBK Worldwide, who will be leading today's conversation. A pioneer of patient recruitment and engagement, Bonnie has helped shape many industry disciplines, and her insights into the workings of clinical and patient communities continue to inform and facilitate BBK's commitment to ensure that the patient perspective is a central focus. With that said, I'd like to hand it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Claire Meunier and Christel Aprigliano, and so many colleagues who are logging in across the globe. We are joined today by representatives from research centers, sponsors, ethics committee members, CROs, specialty recruitment companies, advocacy organizations, and a few patients too. Welcome. In 2013 and early 2014, big data seemed to be the key topic at every industry conference that I was attending. I'm not suggesting that we've fully explored or experienced this topic, but patient centricity certainly has now come to the top of the discussion list. It's not an entirely new idea, as so many of you know. And like you, 20 years ago, BBK was fighting for the idea of using the term patient enrollment rather than the then preferred subject accrual. Patients have come a long way in clinical research since then, so thanks for joining us for the conversation about patient centricity in clinical research. What does it mean? How does it happen? And why is everyone talking about it now? Claire, I'd like to start with you and ask you to share with us what patient centricity means at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And as you process that through for us, if you can also just tell us what it is that you would like us to walk away with this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Bonnie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I think what patient centricity means at the Fox Foundation is that patients are at the center of everything that we do. And I think that's pretty easy for us to say as an advocacy organization in this space. But I think every decision we make, every dollar going out of our door, every resource our staff is investing time and energy in has at the center of it, is this something that's going to accelerate new therapies and eventually a cure for Parkinson's disease? And so what that means is that we sort of have that as our North Star in everything that we're doing. And I think in what that looks like day to day in our activities is that we are bringing the patient voice to the table, whether that means we physically have a patient who's sitting at the table, and I think that is sort of how we traditionally think about patient engagement. And I always say, you know, that's a great idea, but the if and the big if there is that if they're equipped to be active participants in the particular conversation at the table they're being brought to. And we also bring patients to the table as a proxy, and we often spend our time representing the patient voice in a whole host of conversations across drug development. And so I think from my perspective, just making sure that that patient voice is there at every stage, but that it's an appropriate patient voice, and it's a group that's trained or has the capacity, or an individual who is trained or has the capacity to contribute meaningfully to that particular discussion.
can I follow up on that and ask you to explore a little bit more detailed or in ways that people who are listening in might be able to apply this? But when you say someone needs to be equipped and to be trained, can you drill down a little bit more into how you're doing that? You've talked to me about the different panels that you have working at the
So we have
Foundation.
a lot of different groups of patients who are engaging, groups of patients and then individual patients who are engaging in a whole host of different things that we do. And to be clear, we work across the entire drug development pipeline, and we're thinking about sort of what are the intractable issues at every single stage of development and how can we play a role. We have a patient council who's advising the foundation generally. We have a group of trial ambassadors who are focused on increasing the number of people who participate in trials and are very closely tied to our education around trial participation. We have another group of patients who's engaged in a brand new initiative that we're just getting underway focused on big data. We have yet another group of patients who sit on the patient committee of a particular large-scale biomarker study. So we're engaging patients in many different ways. We also bring patients to the table when we're having a meeting with payers, for instance, to better understand the disease experience. But I think one thing that's common every time we're bringing these patients to the table is it's not just an invitation to come and sit and be a part of the conversation, but we want to make sure that we're picking patients and we're assembling groups that then become well-trained to serve the role that we need them to serve. So just as I didn't just come into this job without any onboarding and training, we feel that patients really need that same sort of orientation to drug development. You know, here's what that whole process looks like. You are here in that particular process. Here's what's about to go down, a little bit of a primer in terms of the discussions that they're going to be a part of, and sort of our goals and objectives for bringing a patient to the table. So it's not just that you're bringing them to the table and checking the box of, you know, oh, we've got a patient here, but you're actually bringing them to the table in a meaningful way, giving them a good sense of how we want them to engage. And of course, they may not engage exactly as we prescribe it, but at least they're coming to the table teed up for success. And I think that has been a big part of our success at the Fox Foundation.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. Claire Meunier is the Vice President of Research Engagement at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research and manages efforts related to community education and clinical trial recruitment across the research ecosystem. In this capacity, Claire leads Partners in Parkinson's, the Fox Foundation's multi-million-dollar partnership with industry to inspire patients to build a care team, as well as the Foundation's thought leadership on clinical trial recruitment, including advising Foundation-funded trials on recruitment strategy, as well as overseeing the Fox Trial Finder. Our other panelist, Christel Aprigliano, is the Chief Executive Officer of the Diabetes Collective. Diagnosed at 12 with type 1 diabetes, Christel works with other prominent diabetes online advocates, organizations, and companies to heighten public awareness of and create meaningful positive changes in the diabetes community. She now devotes her efforts to diabetes e-patient, including Strip Safely and CGM Safely, grassroots advocacy movements for blood glucose meter accuracy and continuous glucose monitoring, access for all, for example, and diabetes advocates, which is a group, as Claire was just saying, that's focused on training and empowering patients and caregivers, and also is leading the Diabetes Unconference, which is the first peer-to-peer psychosocial support conference for adults with diabetes. Again, my thanks to both of you for your time and thoughtful insight. Christel, what about you and the Diabetes Collective? What key point do you want to bring home today?
Bonnie, thanks so much for inviting me to come on here. I think what is important for anybody who plays any sort of role in this sort of patient-centric organization mindset is that the patient, and I'm speaking from the patient perspective, patients aren't passive anymore, and we are becoming more educated and more influential because of social media and the internet. And what this has done is it allows us to reach out to a larger group of individuals and mobilize and to continue to have an active participation in different aspects of the pipeline and create new ways for patients to engage with different organizations. What's important to remember, though, is that we're not there for a soundbite. We're there to help ensure that the patient, as Claire puts it, is at the table, whether that's virtually or physically at the table, because the end goal of all of this is to get the right drug or the right therapy to the right patient at the right time. And actively engaging us is going to make a huge difference.
Maybe I can ask each of you to make that a little bit more concrete for people and better understanding what these patient trial ambassadors are being asked to do. Do each of you have a very specific experience that you can share on a particular study, whether it's in the study design or in message development, or what other areas that might happen?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the ambassadors. So they actually came about as a result of a tool that we created called Fox Trial Finder, which works like Match.com for Parkinson's patients and site teams working on clinical trials. And we built that about 3.5 years ago as an action step because we really thought, wow, if we could just have a clearinghouse of trials, patients could put in a profile, automatically get matched to trials, that would go a good way towards solving the problem. And it worked for the first 15,000 people who understood that trials needed people, who understood what it meant to participate, and we're just looking for that action step. Very quickly, though, I think we realized that there are 1 million Parkinson's patients in the U.S. alone, and we had 15,000 of them. So maybe where were the remaining 900,909? Sorry, messing that up.
We got you.
Anywho,
we got you.
So where was everybody else? And I think what we realized was that we needed to take a more proactive role in awareness building and education. And out of that came the opportunity to tap into all the people who had signed up for Fox Trial Finder who said, I signed up, I'm in a trial, what else can I do? And we wanted to harness that energy and figure out a way to sort of use those people to assist us with this awareness building and education. And so they do everything from going into doctors' offices and making sure that doctors know about the tool, going to support groups and making presentations. One of them wrote an op-ed to their local newspaper about the importance of trial participation across all diseases. And recently, we've started to engage them with individual trials. So especially where we have large trials, either that the foundation is involved in or was involved in a previous stage of, we're actually creating a training program to bring these ambassadors up to speed on the specifics of a particular trial, matching them to the site teams that are trying to recruit for this. And now as part of their outreach to go to physicians' offices and support groups and all of that stuff, in addition to spreading the Fox Trial Finder message, they're also educating physicians and patients about the need for particular kinds of patients for specific studies. We especially do this in studies where we need de novo patients or particularly difficult to recruit populations. And we've just started piloting it with our first study, and it's going extremely well. It turns out that when equipped with information about a study, when they're able to ask questions of an investigator, that patients can actually generate great leads for clinical trial sites and actually diminish the amount of work that some of these sites have to do finding people out in the community and sort of get qualified leads teed up for them, when, of course, that's when you really need the expertise of a site to talk to someone about participating, signing consent, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, following up on that, I've seen many sponsors, and there are times when we incorporate this as well, using a patient who's been educated a little bit about the study to do a dry run through one or more sites so that they're helping the research center to understand what the implication of the informed consent, the screening visit, and any other visit might be throughout the course of that program. We're also seeing people use that based on a draft protocol and then take someone through the initial site visit and get the feedback from people so that it might impact aspects of protocol design or protocol development. Christel, what about you? Are there things you'd like to add to this?
You know, Bonnie, one of the things is you've touched upon is actively engaging the patient from the very beginning. And part of this is listening, active listening within the patient community. And in order to find the right individual, it depends on the core competency of what you're looking for, there's going to be somebody in the community that can assist individuals and organizations. So I represent just one very small part of a very large diabetes population. I'm a subset of a subset in 26 million diabetics in just the U.S. alone. So I recognize that there is some difficulty getting the word out there when a lot of individuals in our community are satisfied, quote unquote, with the current treatments. And so to provide some expertise by giving influencers within the community the ability to reach out to help bring people to the clinical trials is crucial. And that does involve organizations becoming active participants within that particular disease state community and engaging with us to find out who the influencers are, because sometimes the most active blogger in our community may not be the person that is going to bring people to clinical trials, but they can provide bandwidth in order to get that information out, to drive that information that you're looking for to the appropriate party.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a really an excellent point, Christel, is that, you know, just as you wouldn't hire any old warm body for any old job that you need done, just any patient isn't appropriate for every single patient seat at the table. You know, we often say one Parkinson's patient is one Parkinson's patient. Their disease experience is divergently different from patient to patient, and the same is true of their skill set and sort of what they offer. And I think it's important to remember, again, back to that, like, we're not just checking a box here. We're actually hand-selecting the right person for the job is important.
I want to just follow on the point you raised, the analogy to having a job. In your organization, are these patient advocates, ambassadors, participants, are they paid, or do they receive a stipend or reimbursement for things? I mean, is that part of how it works?
So if we're physically bringing patients to the table, to our office, to a meeting, et cetera, their costs are covered. We rarely are, I can't think of one instance where we're paying a stipend or sort of additional money. Maybe there are a few one-off examples where, you know, we have a patient who's a former NPR correspondent who moderates day-long symposiums at 11 events throughout the year. You know, he does receive a stipend for that particular work, and maybe there are a few other sort of one-off examples of that, but I would say, you know, our patient council, not paid. Fox Trial Finder ambassadors, not paid. Patient committee for the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative study, not paid. Now, when they come to the annual meeting for that particular study, we pay their way to do so, but there is an additional stipend associated with that.
Okay.
I think it's important, you know, Claire touches upon this, is that while you may be paid for travel, the biggest thing that is most important for me as a patient is to have my voice be heard and understood, and to learn from the particular organization. Patients benefit just as much as the organizations by being involved and being asked to participate. So as much as I would love to get paid for something like that, yay, I think it's more important, wouldn't we all, for our opinions, I think it's important to keep that mindset that my goal is to one day wake up and not have to worry about diabetes. So if I'm going to be working with an organization to help finish that goal and get to that end point, I'm going to do whatever I can, whether or not I'm paid.
And that doesn't surprise me that so many patients would feel that way, would say, you know, it's important for me to make a contribution, and I wouldn't be surprised that people don't ask as individuals for compensation. But I'm curious to know if, and this is the questions that are coming from some of the attendees who are logged on. And if a sponsor is looking to one of your organizations to get access to patients that you have trained and you have vetted to be the appropriate person with the appropriate skill set for that assignment, is that something that you would expect to be compensated in some way, whether it's, you know, it's a grant or an underwriting of the costs or something like that? How does that work?
That's a great question. I would love to have a great answer for it. At this point, if somebody contacts me and says, I need this person with a particular skill set, and if I know somebody who has that skill set, I'm going to pass that information on because, as I said previously, I'm here to ensure that the best therapies get out there as soon as I possibly can get them. And if I don't know somebody with that particular skill set, it's who you know. It's sending you to somebody else who can possibly get that information. So I'm not an information broker. My particular organization is not information brokerage for pay. It's to ensure that we get the right people at the table.
Yeah, I mean, this is Claire. So I'm in the business of what we call de-risking Parkinson's, so making it less expensive and easier for everyone who's involved in drug development to remain involved or to get involved in drug development. So, you know, if it's something that doesn't cost us money and we already sort of have those relationships in place and we can connect you to a patient, that's part of our de-risking strategy. It's a very sort of granular example, but it's a great example of how we want to sort of be the central broker in making these things happen. So, you know, I don't think we would ever charge for that. I think, you know, if a company relied heavily on us to identify multiple patients and to be a part of sort of onboarding them and that kind of thing, you know, we do often direct people to make a donation to the foundation in the name of a particular activity, which they're welcome to do. But I don't think there's ever a requirement that folks sort of pay to play in that way. And I will say, you know, we're eager to be having conversations with any and every player who's working in Parkinson's on a regular basis. And I think you will find that other advocacy organizations may also be open to that kind of similar thing. And so we spend a lot of time with companies talking about, you know, protocol optimization and what we're seeing across the field and those sorts of things that, you know, are sort of freebies that we're giving to folks. I think they see it as, wow, they just gave us all this free information. We see it as, we just saved them a ton of time and now they can actually get to finalizing that protocol or starting that study or whatever it might be. And I do encourage you to engage with the advocacy groups in your particular disease state pretty heavily, because they're having holistic conversations that, you know, if you're positioned at the center of one particular group, one particular player in the entire drug development pipeline, you may not have that same sort of 80,000-foot view, if you will.
And I would encourage those of you who are listening in who are not aware of the EUPATI initiative, the European Patients Academy on Therapeutic Innovation, so it's EUPATI, to look that up online, and because they have a particular program that is targeted to teaching patients about clinical research and what advocacy inside clinical research is about. So there's almost a curriculum there, or the outline of a curriculum that takes us to, what is the most important thing that we need, or things that we need people to understand when we're asking them to participate. I know there are many times when there's an advocate who's sitting at the table while a study is being discussed, and they're adamant that the research should be and should look like this, or should be focused on that. And often will say, this is what you should say about it. But they may not be aware of the role of ethics committees and the role of regulations that guide how we talk about certain things. So that would be a waste, I think, of people's energy to send someone to that meeting, and a way in which our scientific colleagues would dismiss the really valuable information that they could be delivering to the team if they had a little bit more training about what are the guidelines under which we all need to operate. So I'd like to just switch the topic a little bit, because we're using this term patient-centric right now, and I want to ask you if you can to differentiate between the idea of something that's patient-friendly versus something that's patient-centric. Christel, how might these two approaches be viewed or experienced in a population such as patients with diabetes?
So Bonnie, when you and I talked last week, you caught me a little bit off guard, and so I had to. This is a very philosophical question, and this is what I have come to realize. If you're talking about the patient, you're patient friendly. I mean, if you're involving the proper terminology so that the patient can easily understand a protocol, that's one thing. But if you're listening to the patient, you're patient-centric. And by that I mean get them to understand the why and engage in that dialogue from the very outset. And this is not a new concept, as you mentioned, the concept of patient centricity. And I can give you an example, and it's before the age of social media, before the age of the internet, so this can show that it doesn't matter how astute you are and how adept you are at social media or engaging with patients, you can still become a patient-centric organization. 25 years ago, I participated in a clinical trial that involved captopril for diabetics to protect their kidneys. And the principal investigator and I had several conversations before I went in, and I was the very first trial participant. And it was not an easy couple of hours to do this particular IV portion of the trial. And after the fourth vein collapsed, and I was sitting there, and the person who had brought me in said, no, we're done. But because I understood the why and the importance of the clinical trial and what it meant to me and to individuals who were going to benefit from this, I stuck it through and completed the clinical trial because I believed in what the investigator, the principal investigator was doing. And from that point, because that principal investigator continued to share information with me throughout the course of the trial, and then when the trial was completed, sent me the peer-reviewed published, I felt like this was something that, because I knew the why behind it. And so for me, that was patient-centric. It was making sure that the patient understood and that having a continuous dialogue with that. It could have gone the other way. It could have been, we understand that this is really difficult for you, and yeah, okay. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted a patient-centric. And so as I go through the clinical trials that I've completed over the past, we're going on almost 32 years, I'm seeing that sort of ideal patient-centric talking with a patient becoming more and more rote. And I'm hoping that that will continue as we go on. So for individuals with diabetes, and we have a diverse population, it's the holistic approach and understanding the why from the organization side as well as the patient side.
One of the other things you said to me was that patients with diabetes are really defined by our numbers, that it's such a large percent of the world that is struggling with this condition, and all projections are that it's just going to increase exponentially. But when we were talking, and I was thinking about many of the things you were saying, and for me, they met the criteria of patient-friendly. And the more I listened, the clearer it became to me that from your perspective as a patient in this study, at that particular visit, patient centricity meant remembering that I was one person, and my one personal experience mattered. And it brought me home in terms of saying, yeah, we can talk about this as a series of things one might do, but on another level, it's really like a philosophical approach of, at every moment when there is an opportunity to think about the patient and respect the patient's experience at that moment, then we truly move towards patient centricity.
So you did get what I was thinking about then.
I did, but it was different. It was different from what I thought I was going to hear. And I think that's another critical piece of why we're having this conversation today, is sometimes we work on something for decades and we become convinced that we understand, and we mean well, and we intend to understand and believe that we've included the patient voice. And there are many different ways in which the patient's voice, or their lack of voice, we need to be really conscious in our thinking about that and our actions.
We're just not numbers. We're not a series of numbers. And I think that as a patient, when I'm viewed holistically as a human being and not just as a series of lab results, the buy-in is significantly greater for anything that I do in relation to clinical trials.
Now, on the other hand, Claire, as we look at some of these less common conditions, and as we even respond to some of the questions and concerns for those of our audience who are working in truly rare diseases, I think it's my experience that patient centricity, or appreciation of the patient, and every single patient, is much more common because there are so few of them. We can't afford to sort of blow it with any one individual patient or their family or caregivers. Can you talk a little bit about the difference from your perspective of patient centricity and patient friendliness?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're certainly not a rare disease. I know that's not what you were suggesting, but we are smaller than diabetes, smaller than Alzheimer's, and so I think our challenge is that we're not so rare that our patients are impossible to find, and finding each one is like gold, but we're not so common like diabetes, where it's like it's a no-brainer to solve this because it affects such a large portion of the population. And so sometimes with our patient-friendly, patient-centric question, I find that we do well mostly on the patient-friendly, but the patient-centric is really that taking it to the next level. And, I think, Christel, your example is a perfect one, and, something we spend a lot of time working with studies on, really just thinking about how can I share more about the science? How can I share more about sort of the aspirational reasons of being part of this, and not just cut to the, you're going to need 7 lumbar punctures. Will you do it or not?
No.
Piece of this. And so, it's interesting how investigators start out sometimes on that particular topic around Parkinson's, where we don't see that test done often. I think the best example for us is actually a drug that was coming from diabetes. It was an injectable substance and coming over to be tested in Parkinson's disease. And this is actually a pretty recent example. A year ago, I was sitting on the phone with them doing recruitment planning and recruitment strategy work, as we do with every Fox-funded study. And we were talking about sort of what I call funnel filling, which is how do you find the best, the right people, the people who match your inclusion, exclusion. And then the second activity, which I said often gets overlooked, is what I call conversion. What do you do with the perfect lead to get them from knowing nothing about your study to actually getting them to sign consent and enroll? And in this particular case, we were talking about conversion. It's a diabetes drug being injected. And when we talked about materials for patients, the sponsor said, oh, we have that taken care of. We worked really hard on that when we did the diabetes trial, and we feel very comfortable that we can just use the same thing in Parkinson's disease. And I sort of chuckled a little bit and then said, diabetes patients are used to injecting themselves, and even if they're not currently on an injectable therapy, they're sort of open to the idea that their disease may require it, whereas Parkinson's patients never inject themselves with anything. They go to the doctor for shots. And so this idea that patients would be self-administering these injectables may be a little bit more, may need a little bit more work for this Parkinson's study than what you did before. And the response was, no, we know what we're doing, trust us. So about a month ago, our clinical team posted me that this study is significantly behind on recruitment, that finding people with the particular condition that they were looking for was not a problem at all, but that they were really having a hard time selling the study and getting people to agree to participate. And I did what I usually do, which is get on the phone in these particular instances and sort of talk through with the sponsor and a few of the sites sort of what's working, what's not, where are things breaking down. And what it really came down to was that Parkinson's patients weren't open to being injected. And that, to me, I think really illustrates this idea of like, oh, we're being patient-friendly. We have all these materials on the therapy, all these materials on the injectables. We're fine, without actually thinking about sort of patients aren't patients. What's the difference between a diabetic patient and a Parkinson's patient? And, what's the difference between how receptive they might be to this delivery mechanism? And so, the end of that story goes like this. I worked with them to sort of call some best practice, some insights from the sites about what is it about the injections that's scary to Parkinson's patients? Where do they shut down? Where do they fall out of this process? And then how can we develop some talking points to make sure coordinators are equipped to talk about this? Because it turns out when they're talking about this, because coordinators aren't used to talking to Parkinson's patients about injections either, when they're presenting the study, they have this look on their face that seems scared because they're not used to even bringing this up with patients in the first place. And then what can we send home with patients that talks about this and demystifies it and shows we're being transparent about it and shows that we have a plan in place if they're having trouble injecting themselves and those sorts of things. And as a result, those materials are in IRB now. I have pretty good confidence that those will actually end up being the turnaround for this particular study. I hate that we have to wait until rescue mode to bring these things into the process, but our role is really always trying to bring them up as early as possible, getting them IRB approved with the first round of things rather than waiting until we're sort of way behind. But I think that's an example to me of when we're really sort of being fully present to the patient that's going to be in front of us or that is in front of us versus this sort of, oh, we were taking a patient-friendly approach.
Mm-hmm. And as you talk about that, it reminds me of the reality that very often the clinical teams or the CRO group that's in charge of enrollment is using the right tools, perhaps, but not saying the right thing, not recognizing that something needs to be taught from a different perspective for the Parkinson's patients, as you just explained, versus the how of it, or just reminders for diabetes
And one of the
patients.
things I talk about a lot is that providing those talking points, really thinking hard about this target of who we're trying to recruit, is the responsibility of the sponsor and the CRO. Those are things that should not be replicated at 56 sites across the country. Those are things that should be happening centrally, should be well thought out centrally, and then should be disseminated to sites. And I think that's one of the biggest culture changes that I face in working with Parkinson's trials, to really get sponsors and CROs to see that as their job. And I often hear from them, oh, but we've picked the best sites out there in Parkinson's. And I say, you know, that's all good and well, but that doesn't mean that they have all the time in the world for every study they're involved in to develop a robust plan. And, you know, it's your money on the line, or our money on the line. So we all have a vested interest in making sure that it's well thought out and well planned. And I spend a lot of my time working with sponsors and with CROs on these particular issues, and it's whatever it takes to get to a cure, so we're doing it.
Before we move on, because you've given me a nice lead into another angle on discussion of money, I just want to remind all of those of you who are listening in that now would be a really good time, if you've been holding on to a question, to type it into the question box. We're going to explore one other area, and then I'm going to incorporate some of the questions that have come up that have been outside of what we had planned to talk about. So if you'd please do that, we would appreciate it. Okay, so here's the next piece. One of the questions that I often hear, and of course I hear it about every aspect of patient engagement, enrollment, retention, is how do you measure the impact of this particular approach? And in the case of a patient-centric approach, which is not necessarily tactical, it's an interesting question. So how do you measure the impact, or in the words of many, what's the ROI on being patient-centric? Christel, you shared with me a story the other day that I thought was very powerful. Maybe you can share that with the group today again.
Sure. I'm more than happy to. This is sort of it's like lobbing me a question of what's the ROI. Here's the easiest answer I can give you. Patients do make a difference. On April 3rd, the FDA advisory committee voted in favor of approving MannKind's Afrezza. And Afrezza is an inhalable rapid insulin, which is the first of its kind. Normally we inject insulin, or it's done through infusion by an insulin pump. And before that advisory committee met, despite all of the work that MannKind had done, it was still up in the air whether or not FDA was going to approve that. And so what happened was that on April 3rd, patient advocates came and spoke at that advisory committee meeting. And they spoke about patients needing a wider range of options and opportunities for improving the patient experience. And the fact is that for people with diabetes, insulin it's a dangerous drug. And when you recognize that insulin overdosing, which can happen, and it's quite often, serious insulin overdosing is associated with over 97,000 ER visits and 29,000 hospital admissions within a 4-year period. And in those same 4 years, methamphetamine overdoses resulted in 93,000 ER visits. Insulin beat meth in that case. And so despite the fact that MannKind had gone through multiple safety trials and showed that the safety data was compelling to help prevent these overdosing by not having to worry about taking too much to cover a meal. And the FDA believes that patient safety first, but in most cases their decisions are made without patient input. And so several advocates came and spoke, and we actually had one individual who was unable to attend but pre-recorded his discussion about the fact that we need innovative insulins and we need options, and that the risk-benefit analysis from a patient perspective was appropriate for approval for this. And on June 27th, the FDA approved MannKind's Afrezza. And for me, what I see is the ROI. MannKind has a drug, and patients have another choice for treatment. So we all win. And it's won not just in financial gain by a company, but for the patients as well, for choices. And without patients being there from the very beginning to the very end, this wouldn't have happened. Because walking into that advisory committee, it was a less than 50% chance that it would be approved. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it reminds me, too, that there are a number of sponsor organizations, and I heard at a recent conference from a colleague at Eli Lilly, for example, that when a new protocol is going to committee for their internal committee for review, discussion, approval, one of the questions that the team has to answer is, what was the patient input into developing this program? And I think it's a terrific example of how organizations are really bringing this concept to bear inside their process. And so that it's, as I think it was you, Claire, who said it earlier, that it's not just ticking the box, but it's really absorbing the point of view and the philosophy of putting patients first. Claire, what about you? Do you have a story that you want to tell that responds to this ROI question?
Sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we measure it in dollars and time. So, what is the return on being patient-centric? Is that we're getting things to market faster because we're tapped in to what patients need, what patients want, and what their threshold for tolerating the costs of it or the severity of a symptom are. And so I think the best example I can come up with is probably the Foundation's quest to validate a biomarker for Parkinson's disease progression. So as many of you know, biomarkers are important things to have because they tell us how a disease, or that a disease is present in the first place, how it progresses, and then much more biological information for drug targeting and those sorts of things. And so the Foundation has invested about $65 million to date in a study called the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative to do this. And when we initially set out, we probably picked the hardest to recruit population in Parkinson's disease, which is de novo patients, so patients who aren't currently taking therapy, who are in the first 2 years of diagnosis. And this was the study that we had 7 lumbar punctures in. It was an observational study, no potential of a new therapy, difficult to recruit population, and we're asking a whole lot. And the field sort of responded to us and said, you're crazy. And then a few of them came to the table and said, we'll be sites, but we need your help. And this was really our first foray into the Foundation being at the center of designing recruitment strategies, recruitment materials, tapping into a patient committee that sort of thing. And we sort of arbitrarily set a recruitment timeline of 2 years, and we were able to do it in 27 months. So we were about 3 months over what our target was. But I think, you know, this was a study that is a field need. It is probably not something that any one entity would have undertaken on their own. And we were able to create a movement around the importance of a biomarker, and I think around, to Christel's earlier point, around the rationale and the reason for this being so important, rather than creating a movement around 7 lumbar punctures, which we quickly learned was not something that you necessarily want to lead a conversation with. But that was an important thing for us to help really get nitty-gritty with sites on and figure out, how are you going to talk about this? What training do you need? Why don't you go see one? There are other disease states that do these all the time. And to really sort of get in the weeds with our sites to make all of that possible. And I think much of our work in this area contributed to the aggressive recruitment sort of rate that we were able to achieve. And the result is that it took us half the time it took Alzheimer's to recruit the same number of people, and we're now that much closer to biomarker verification in the field. And so,
and what I like and value so much about those two stories is that these are significant contributions to the advancement of therapies or disease understanding. This is not just about, well, I asked patients to give us feedback on a brochure or an advertisement, or we took videos of patients and showed them at our investigator meetings. It's really a much more profound partnership with patients that is driving research that both is important to the sponsor organizations, whether they're commercial sponsors, academic sponsors, et cetera, as well as of value and important to the patients they treat. We have a number of questions about specific things that an organization can do to bring patients into the process. And also a lot more questions that are coming about the, how do I talk to my management about return on investment? So if I could sort of marry those two things together with a final question to each of you. If you could do one thing, or advise our attendees to do one thing to make their next research study more patient-centric, what would that be?
I have about a zillion things, but I think
okay.
that sure, if I could go ahead and, because when I think that if I had the opportunity to help make a difference as a patient, the first thing obviously is to ask the patients to get involved and to work with the disease state population in the community to find out how you can improve the process. Because I want you all to remember this, is that we do talk about you. We talk about drug trials. We talk about particular organizations. We talk about different types of pharma and biopharma within our communities. You may not see that, but there are conversations that are going on via email, via Twitter, via Facebook, all sorts of different avenues. So the first step is reaching out and listening to your particular disease state community, whether it's online or asking them to come and be a part of a discussion. We have had great success mobilizing our own community because a few organizations deemed it important enough to get the patient perspective, patient-centric, and brought individuals in to sit down for brainstorming sessions amongst the different advocates and to help design ways to communicate with a large amount of patients. So start engaging is maybe what I want to say, is because we're ready to engage because we're already talking about you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, too, of thinking, how many, asking myself this question, how many clinical study managers have met with patients with the condition they're studying within the 30 days, the last 30 days? Is, you know, they'll often make a commitment to spend time with key opinion leaders, maybe the head of an advocacy group, but are we, as a field of researchers, other than the physicians who treat these patients, are we sitting down with them? Do we have a very personal, sort of going back to your early definition of patient-centric, a very personal exchange? Claire, we've got another minute or two. Do you have one thing that you suggest that the listeners take on first or incorporate into their program?
Yeah, I just don't wait too long. I think it's never too early to start engaging with patients and an advocacy group to say, you know, we're in the planning stages, this is what we're doing. Is there a place where you all think you can be valuable at this stage, or here's what the next 6 months for us look like? What are the opportunities for us to get you integrated? And, you know, I hate when studies come to us at the moment that they're in rescue mode. And in some respects, it's too late. But, you know, in others, we can be somewhat helpful and really help them sort of think through things that they probably should have done up front. And I think the other thing I would say is take the time up front, especially as a sponsor or the lead PI on a study. Take the time up front to really get in the head of the patient who's going to be a part of the study. And whether that's using an advocacy group to understand sort of some things they should be keeping in mind, or whether that's engaging a patient who's well equipped to be a part of that conversation to really talk to you about their experience. I love that idea of sort of walking someone through the protocol and seeing how it works. Take that time, because I think it saves a lot on the back end. And I think, you know, in my experience, we often see folks not wanting to invest up front, and then when the recruitment time period has to be doubled, they're happy to invest 10 times what it would have cost them up front to do that. Mm-hmm. So just be forward thinking and bring us into the conversation as early as possible.
Yes, as early as possible. So I guess to wrap this up and summarize what we've been talking about, if you're not putting your patients first, somebody else definitely is or will be. And so patient centricity is no longer just a nice to have. It's really a critical component of any study's success. So we're proposing that thoughtful and effective patient engagement and retention strategies be employed throughout the entire clinical trial process, and that the patient's contribution to clinical research and the advancement of treatment options cannot be underestimated. And I think Christel explained that beautifully in the Mankind study. So regardless of the inherent complexities of study management, clinical trial sponsors have an obligation to ensure patients have the best clinical trial experience possible. And whether through mobile apps and other technologies, our approach to sophisticated metrics-driven analyses or study branding and advertising that matters to patients, my colleagues and I at BBK are committed to putting patients and study participants first. I know that Claire and Christel share this philosophy, as do their organizations. We welcome you to reach out to any of us, and in the next day we will be providing you with links to the audio version of this. We will also be providing written answers to all of the questions, those that we tried to tackle in person and those that we did not get to. And we very much appreciate all of your time this afternoon and hope you're able to take something useful and important out of our discussion. Jenny, did you have any last-minute things you needed to share with us?
No, I would just like to thank our attendees and our panelists, Bonnie, Claire, and Christel, and for joining us today. If you have any further questions or need any further information, you can also reach me at jpereira@iirusa.com. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.